my name is Paul Timm, and we want to thank you for joining us today for this edition of In Session video series. We're going to be focusing on lessons from the pandemic and everything that we can do to make the learning environment safer. My name is Paul Timm. As mentioned, I am the Vice President of Physical Security Services for Facility Engineering Associates. I have a physical security professional credential that I earned through ASIS International back in 2003. I also wrote a book called School Security, and I like to kid around and say it's all about school security. You have to call it what it is, otherwise people aren't going to be able to find it, but it was published, the first edition in 2015, and the second edition was just published last year. I sit on the advisory board for the campus safety conferences, and I'm also part of the ASIS International School Safety and Security Community Steering Committee. So if you could digest all of that, kudos to you. But I'm going to be joined today by Ryan Love, who is the coordinator of safety and security for the Cajon Valley Union School District. Again, Ryan, not making it easy. Both of us have all kinds of words to put in sequence here. I want to mention that besides having a distinguished career in law enforcement, Ryan was a Campus Safety Director of the Year finalist in 2019, and I'm awfully glad to have him, in fact, honored to have him with me today. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for those kind words. I'm really excited about this conversation and looking forward to it.
Well, and as am I. And we are what many people are hoping is in that season of post-pandemic, and we don't know for sure if it's really over with or if there's going to be another variant, but we've cleared some hurdles. We've been able to shed some restrictions and return to some semblance of normalcy. So I want to talk about maybe lessons learned during the pandemic and start with, I think maybe I'm actually going to let you start by talking about some of the key lessons that you have learned in your school district.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I know every district is different, and they all have had their different challenges. With the Cajon Valley Union School District, we never really went into a full lockout. We tried to continue to maintain we had our first school that continued to be open after the lockout was ordered by the state. And what we did is we had childcare. And we opened childcare not only for our district families, but for all families within our region in the El Cajon, California area. And so what that allowed us to do for our district was to see what the challenges were going to be when we were all able to come back full time. And so we did learn some things early on. One was, I think, very important was the one entrance in, one entrance out mentality. We never did really focus on that too much before the pandemic, but with contact tracing, we found out that was a big, purpose for not just having anybody come onto your campus. And so from a safety standpoint, as you know, Paul, that was great for us because now staff is assisting the security folks with maintaining that safe environment by having just that one access.
Yeah, and I like to call that sort of a silver lining of the pandemic. I know that we all look at it and go, "Oh my gosh, everything was altered and altered in a way that was in some ways painful." But I think visitor management would be one of those areas, and the greater banner here would be access control. And maybe even wayfinding, where people had to get with a specific program, and that enabled us from a culture in schools where maybe we were letting people in or people were piggybacking in places they shouldn't have gone. Everyone needed to almost walk the line, and I think that kind of change in access control has been a silver lining.
Absolutely.
One of the other things I noticed, because we were doing some security assessments during the pandemic, is many districts stopped doing visitor management at all because there were no visitors permitted in the buildings. And I wonder what that was like for you guys as you went from those early days of 2020 into the early months of this year.
Yeah, we actually shut down our visitor management software because we were not allowing our parent population to come on, or any visitors to come onto our campus. And so for us, we didn't really need that software. We were still checking students in, obviously, but we weren't allowing parents to walk their kids onto campus. They would literally drive up. They would give their name. Their student would be COVID screened, and then we would walk them in. Our staff would walk them into campus. So yeah, we were not utilizing our visitor management system at all during that whole entire even lockout period when we even had kids on our campuses.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Tell me if you're using any of these features, because a number of features have surfaced during the pandemic, including the ability to do screening, health questions right there on our visitor management, in our visitor management software system, screening. You mentioned contact tracing before, and I know that some have used visitor management for that. And I also know that some, I used to hand you my I used to hand you my ID, and then you would scan it. And I know that now we've seen some devices where it's contactless, meaning I can put my own ID in a scanner that looks sort of like a toaster. It draws it down and pops it back up. Tell me, what kinds of features are you using now that maybe you were not using pre-pandemic?
Well, we actually never enter, and yeah, you're right. We did have that ability to enter the contact tracing screening questions into our visitor management system software. But because we were not allowing parents to even get out of their vehicles, we decided to have staff literally sit out in the front of the school with almost like a clipboard and doing the checklist ourselves. So we never really had them utilizing anything that they were putting, like you said, a scanner in. We just shut that down completely. And for us, it was just to maintain that integrity and keeping it the same, even during not only drop off, but during pickup as well. We weren't letting parents come onto the campuses, and we just wanted to keep it simple. The parents loved it because they could just literally drop up. It was like, driving through a fast food restaurant, drop their kids off or pick them up, and it saved them a lot of time. And then what was really nice about that is traffic flowed a lot easier during that time because the process was pretty much, cars were parking, they were driving up, dropping their kids off, and heading out the parking lot.
Speaking of navigation, I wonder if you could speak to the mindset of your security personnel and your law enforcement officers. And I just wonder what kind of lessons were learned as we moved through the pandemic there.
Well, Zoom classrooms became a thing,
Yeah.
right? And so when we actually did finally just open our schools up, we did like a hybrid, and we gave our parents an option. We said, you can either have your kids come on campus full time, you can have them participate on the Zoom classroom full time, or you can do a hybrid approach. And so we allowed them that option. And so what came out of the Google or the Zoom classrooms was staff were seeing concerning behaviors because you got these kids that are at home, mom and dad are at work, right? And so they're seeing things. How do you discipline that? How do you discipline a kid that is flipping off the teacher, or you see a weapon, which had happened. We saw one student had a weapon in the background, and we called law enforcement. And law enforcement, they're dealing with a lot, so sometimes they would come out on certain things depending on how busy and crazy they were, because it was that time where they were getting calls, at the grocery store because somebody wasn't wearing a mask, right? And so they're dealing with a whole lot. And so at one point, we just paused and we said, let's find out from the stakeholders how we can create something to disseminate to not just our district, but to the entire county. So what we did is I actually reached out to the district attorney's office, and then she reached out to some of the higher ups in law enforcement, who reached out to our psychiatric emergency response team, and who reached out to our child protective services. And so what we did is we actually developed a committee where we talked about what we would do, what would be our response when a teacher sees this. And it was kind of like a threat assessment chart where it may not be black and white, but you knew to ask the next question as to whether or not law enforcement should be involved, or do we need to keep taking it a step further and ask a couple more questions just to vet what it is we're really seeing on these Zoom, or hearing on these Zoom classrooms. And so we were able to disseminate that information countywide, and it was a learning experience, because that's something that none of us, out of the 6 or 7 folks that were involved in these meetings, it was like a big it was like a cargo plane getting off the ground. It was slow, and we finally got the momentum. And we were able to achieve, I think, something pretty big in a short period of time.
Yes. And I think that's well said. And I'm going to put that and one other thing right under silver lines of the pandemic. And that is that the collaborative efforts, whether we wanted to do it or not, we were forced into a place where that collaboration, I think, is going to pay off in the long term. And the other thing, I think, of course, we talk about Zoom and all of the fallout with the virtual learning environment. And yet, if we find ourselves weeks or months from now in a severe weather type incident or something like that and have to go virtual, we're ready. And nobody wanted to get there this way, but we're far more prepared to go back and forth and be agile than we were before. So anyway, Ryan, thank you so much. Coordinator of School Safety and Security for the Cajon Valley Union School District. Thanks so much for joining us today, Ryan.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, and I always enjoy speaking with you, Paul.
I want to speak just briefly on some details regarding access control, and I want to begin with the perimeter and then work our way to the classroom area. But when we think about the perimeter, when we have districts like Ryan's that have multiple buildings on a single campus, we have difficulties. In many places in the country, we have multiple buildings on a single campus. And what do we do when we've got exterior hallways? Obviously, it's not an easy thing from an access control standpoint. And I find myself a lot of times on multi-building campuses, walking from one building to the next and finding a door just unlocked. And this is during class time, not during passing periods. So what do we do in those situations to improve our access control? And many schools are leveraging their electronic access control system and even providing students with cards during class time. During passing periods, we may program that door open for the 6 minutes or whatever the passing period is time. But as soon as passing period is over and we've got some monitoring of that door, it then will automatically lock. But what would we do with a student who needs to move between buildings during class time? And that student, instead of getting traditionally what would have been a paper pass or something like that, is going to get a card. And that card will then grant them access into the next building. And when they reach their destination, they'll turn in that card. It's also a good way of accounting for whether or not students got to the place we just gave them permission to go. But what we know is that in order to run a closed campus, which is the idea for everybody, we just cannot have unlocked doors between buildings. If we have a single building campus, and again, many schools across the nation have that, we want to try to run a closed campus by keeping all of the exterior doors locked, including even the single point of entry, or what we would call the main entrance, where we're going to authorize that person before they get into the secured vestibule. We like to point out with a secured vestibule that you can't really call it that if you have immediate access once you walk into the vestibule into the main office. That's not a secured vestibule, and we're then really putting the administrative assistants who are in the main office on the front line. We like to have visitor management exacted while in the secured vestibule, and once they have stated a legitimate purpose for being in the building, then the administrative assistant would grant them access to come into the main office. A lot of schools are accomplishing this with a pass-through window, and occasionally we're finding that those pass-through windows can be opened far enough that somebody could actually access that. So I want you to be careful to make sure that there is a limit in terms of how wide that pass-through window can be opened. All of those things are important from a perimeter standpoint, and we could also include things like vehicle barriers, which would help us control access, and in border definition, perhaps provided by fencing. Even unauthorized roof access because of building features is a danger that we face, and we want to try to address those issues on the perimeter. Once we're inside the building, it becomes very important that we have classroom security, and I want to speak to that because this is really a heated debate right now, and I want to mention the dangers that are associated with barricade devices. Now, before we even talk about barricade devices, I want to say this. I think I have yet to encounter a school that did not have locks on that classroom, a lock on that classroom door. And that lock, as we have seen from the post Sandy Hook report and the post Marjorie Stoneman Douglas report, has never really been breached by a bad guy. So I want to state that very clearly. The classroom door lock provides the kind of security that we need. The issue operationally is that sometimes we're leaving that door unlocked and it becomes difficult to lock it, or we're leaving that door locked but open and we've actually got to step into the hallway to grab the handle to close that. And that's where the manufacturers of barricade devices have capitalized on fear, uncertainty, and doubt by offering a secondary locking mechanism. We want to caution people to avoid those, and I want to say at all costs to avoid those. They introduce more risks than they solve, or introduce more risks than they address. And I want to mention a couple of those risks. The first one comes from the National Fire Protection Association, which says one motion, a single motion to egress room, I push down on the handle, I can almost fall into the handle, and it's going to permit me to egress the room. Why is that a big deal? Well, I'm from Chicago, where 60 plus years ago, Our Lady of the Angels Catholic School burned to the ground and almost 100 people died. And after that, we had to put in place codes that would permit people free egress from rooms. If we have a barricade device, that is going to require a minimum of 2 motions to egress the room. It also requires prior knowledge to be able to deploy or remove that kind of barricade device. Let me move on to ADA. The Americans with Disabilities Act says no tight pinching or grasping needed to be able to egress. Again, that's why we moved from knobs to handles, so we could be able to freely egress the room. And as I do security assessments across the country, I've had any number of times an individual with disabilities express concern that they would not be able to deploy or remove that barricade device. And finally, I want to mention the barricade device can be used, and in some instances has been used by the bad guy to prevent the good guys from being able to leave the room. If I were to enter a room where right on the door frame is a metal piece that I can drop in a bracket on the floor that prevents egress from the room, I now have captives in the room. And what we are finding is that on occasion, people are using those devices meant to protect us against us. So again, I want to caution all of you viewing this today against the use of barricade devices. Well, having said all of those things, I want to thank you for joining us today. We're going to leave you with a couple resources. The first one is the Federal Repository for School Security and Emergency Preparedness Resources, and you can find that at schoolsafety.gov. It's a relatively new website funded by the federal government indefinitely moving forward, and you're going to find all kinds of helpful resources there. The second one is the Partner Alliance for Safer Schools, or passk12.org. And this not-for-profit organization is made up of those who are consultants, architects, law enforcement officials, vendors, manufacturers, and practitioners who all have kind of put their agendas aside and gotten together and said, what are the guidelines that schools should have in place? And then boiled those guidelines down to a checklist, which again is free for you to obtain at passk12.org. Please continue to view our in-session video series at this website that you see on your screen. And I will hopefully be making another appearance in a roundtable where I'll chat with other industry experts about the changing landscape of school security. Thank you again for joining us today.